Okay, let's go. Number 1. Cueva de los Tallos. You're a Scottish engineer named Stan Hall, and it's 1973, and you're standing at the edge of a vertical shaft in the Ecuadorian jungle, staring down into 230 feet of absolute black. The Shuar people who brought you here are watching you with an expression you can't quite read. Not fear, something quieter than fear. The ropes are rigged. The ladder drops into the dark. You go down. 3 years later, Neil Armstrong descended the same shaft. He came back up, and then he said nothing. Cueva de los Tallos sits in the Morona Santiago province of southeastern Ecuador, carved through limestone by the Rio Pastaza drainage system at an altitude of around 1,200 feet in the Andean foothills. The cave's name translates to Cave of the Oil Birds, named for the Tallos nocturnal birds that nest inside the upper chambers in numbers large enough to darken the entrance at dusk. The Shuar, one of the most studied indigenous nations in South America, have known the cave for as long as their oral tradition reaches backward. They say it connects to an underground city. They say things live there that don't live above ground. They don't go in. They guard the entrance instead. The first non-indigenous account that drew serious international attention came from a Hungarian-Ecuadorian adventurer named Janos Moric. In the 1960s, Moric claimed to have entered the cave and discovered chambers containing a library not of paper or clay, but of metal. Books of beaten gold and platinum, he said, engraved with an unknown script, stored in rooms with walls of polished stone. He called it the Metallic Library. He said the books told a history of the world. He made his claim to the Ecuadorian government in a notarized 1969 document that still exists in Ecuadorian public records, and then he refused to lead anyone back to the exact location. Here's where it gets strange. In 1972, Stan Hall, a Scottish engineer with no prior cave exploration credentials, read about the Metallic Library claim and became obsessed. He spent 4 years building what became the largest privately organized cave expedition in recorded history. 100 participants. Members of the British Army's Special Air Service, the SAS, one of the most elite special operations units on Earth, Ecuadorian military personnel, archaeologists, biologists, geologists. The expedition had corporate sponsors and governmental support from both the British and Ecuadorian governments, and, as its honorary president, Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, a figure who, by 1976, had no professional reason to descend into a jungle cave in South America, and every reason not to. He was a private man, notoriously protective of his reputation, deeply selective about which projects he attached his name to. He didn't just lend his name, he physically went in. The expedition ran for 3 weeks in August 1976. Officially, it documented extraordinary cave formations, pre-Columbian human remains, stone tools, and evidence of sustained ancient Shuar habitation inside the upper chambers. They produced a report describing a remarkable site of archaeological and biological significance. It did not mention a metallic library. Armstrong gave almost no public comment about what he saw, not in the press conferences that followed, not in the interviews he granted in later years, not in the private correspondence that his estate released after his death in 2012. A man who described every second of his lunar approach in obsessive technical detail, the pitch rate, the fuel consumption, the shadow angle on the regolith, gave the world nothing about what he found, 230 feet below the Ecuadorian jungle. There is one documented quote, given to an Ecuadorian journalist in 1976, in which Armstrong said the expedition had been very interesting and that the cave contains things that deserve further study. That's all. The Ecuadorian government has restricted access to Cueva de los Tallos multiple times since 1976. An academic team in 2012, working under a permit from Ecuador's Ministry of Culture, documented new sections of the cave using ground-penetrating radar and found stone formations in several passages that appeared deliberately placed, arranged stone that blocked access to lower passages. The team recommended further excavation. No follow-up permit was granted. Stan Hall spent the rest of his life trying to get back inside. He died in 2008, still pushing for a return expedition. The mainstream explanation is that the Metallic Library is a hoax. Moric was a fantasist. Hall was credulous. Armstrong attended because the expedition was legitimate in its scientific aims, even if its foundational premise, the library, was fabricated. The stone formations blocking lower passages are natural flowstone deposits, but Armstrong didn't attach his name to fabrications. His entire post-NASA career was defined by a refusal to endorse things he didn't believe were real. He turned down hundreds of commercial endorsements. He went to Cueva de los Tallos, physically descended, and came back with nothing to say. That choice, that particular deliberate silence from that particular deliberate man, is either the most unremarkable thing in this story or the most revealing. What was in the lower passages blocked by stone? What did Neil Armstrong find 230 feet below the Ecuadorian jungle that was interesting enough to go in and too significant to discuss on the way out? The cave doesn't answer. It never has. Armstrong went silent going in and came out the same way. But silence isn't always official policy. Sometimes it's something more primal, something that takes language from you before you even reach the bottom. Number 2. Chiquibul Cave System. You're a biologist from the University of Belize, and it's 1989, and you've been inside the Chiquibul for 4 hours, when the passage behind you stops being the one you entered by. The cave runs through the limestone karst of the Maya Mountains in a way that defies mapping. Passages split and reconnect. Underground rivers change level with rainfall, and chambers open onto chambers in a sequence that doesn't repeat. You've kept markers. The markers are there. The geometry is wrong. You spend 6 hours finding your way back to daylight. You file a report. The report describes an interior architecture that experienced cavers describe consistently in one word: hostile. Chiquibul is not one cave. It is a system, one of the largest in the Western Hemisphere, running through the Vaca Plateau in western Belize, extending toward the Guatemalan border in ways that no complete survey has captured. The mapped passages exceed 23 miles. The unmapped sections are estimated to be significantly larger. The system has multiple levels, at least 3 distinct underground rivers, and a vertical range of more than 1,000 feet from its highest chambers to its lowest known sump. The Maya Mountains above it have been continuously occupied for at least 4,000 years. Everything they built on top of what was underneath. The Maya didn't just live near Chiquibul, they went inside it. Archaeological surveys in the 1980s and 1990s found Maya ceremonial deposits at multiple locations within the cave system: pottery, jade offerings, obsidian blades, incense burners, and skeletal remains. The deepest confirmed Maya artifact finds were located more than 2 miles from the nearest entrance, in chambers reachable only by navigating passages flooded part of the year. Getting there required what the Maya accomplished with torches and no modern equipment: sustained navigation through a cave system that has disoriented trained researchers with headlamps and compasses. The remains found deep inside were not burial remains. They were ritual deposits. The Maya were making offerings to something they believed lived in the deeper passages of Chiquibul, something they were willing to travel 2 miles underground to reach. The disappearances are documented, not ancient ones, recent ones. Chiquibul sits along the Belize-Guatemala border, in a region where illegal looting of Maya sites has been endemic for decades. Looters, primarily entering from the Guatemalan side, have been documented going into the cave system to extract artifacts for the international black market. The Belize Defense Force, which patrols the border zone, maintains records of looters who entered Chiquibul and were never seen again. Not captured, not expelled, not found dead elsewhere, simply gone. The cave's interior is not recoverable in the conventional sense. If you reach the wrong passage when the underground rivers are running, your body goes where the water goes. No one follows. In 2001, a joint Belizean-American archaeological team entered a previously unrecorded passage in the cave's northern section and found a chamber containing Maya remains and offerings that radiocarbon dating placed at approximately 900 CE. The chamber showed evidence of deliberate sealing. A stone wall had been placed across the passage leading into it. The wall had been breached from the outside at some point after the original sealing. By whom and when has not been established. The team submitted a full excavation proposal to Belize's Institute of Archaeology. The proposal was approved. A follow-up expedition was scheduled, postponed again, then quietly removed from the Institute's active project list. No reason was given. The mainstream explanation for the disappearances is hydrology and disorientation. Chiquibul's underground rivers can flash flood a passage in minutes. Anyone caught in a lower section during a flood event cannot be recovered. The disappearances reflect the cave's genuine physical danger, not anything more mysterious. The sealed Maya chamber reflects standard ritual practice. The Maya regularly sealed important spaces after ceremonies. But the Maya traveled 2 miles underground, repeatedly, in the dark, to leave valuable offerings in chambers no one could accidentally find. That's not a burial practice. That's a sustained relationship with something at depth. The Belize Institute of Archaeology pulled a funded, approved excavation from its active list without explanation. Whatever the 2001 team found in that chamber, whatever the breached stone wall implied about who had been inside since the original sealing, it was enough to make the Institute decide not to go back. What did the Maya believe lived in the deeper passages of Chiquibul that was worth 2 miles of underground travel and jade offerings to reach? What happened to the people the Belize Defense Force has no record of exiting? And what did the 2001 team find in that sealed chamber that made a funded excavation quietly disappear? The cave keeps its census. Everyone who goes in is noted. Not everyone who comes out is. That particular record-keeping is older than Belize, older than the Maya who made offerings to whatever waited at the bottom. The next cave didn't take anyone. It took silence instead, and the silence came from the people who studied it. Number 3. Gouffre Berger. You're on a limestone plateau above Grenoble in 1953, and a geologist named Joseph Berger is probing the ground with a metal rod the way cavers do, pressing it into cracks, feeling for drafts, listening for the exhale of deep air that signals a void below. The Vercors Plateau has yielded cave systems before. This particular crack, near the village of Sassenage, doesn't look special. He marks the coordinates and goes home. What he found was the deepest known cave in the world for a decade. What went into it was the best caving teams in Europe. What came out of it, eventually, was silence. The Gouffre Berger descends through the Vercors limestone at a near vertical pitch for its first several hundred feet, then opens into galleries, underground rivers, siphons, and chambers that extend to a confirmed depth of 3,680 feet below the surface. It held the world depth record from 1956 to 1963. For those 7 years, the Berger was the frontier. Every elite caving expedition in Europe wanted to claim it. Multiple expeditions did. 3 people died. The deaths were attributed to flash flooding. The cave's interior hydrology is still not fully understood. The underground river in its lower sections responds to surface rainfall faster than cavers at 3,000 feet below can receive any warning. In 1956, a British expedition led by David Hazeler reached new depths and documented something that had no entry in any standard incident report framework. Sounds. Not water. Not settling limestone. Not the standard acoustic behavior of a deep cave. A resonant sound, rhythmic, emanating from beyond a siphon at the lower end of the explored system. The team recorded it on magnetic tape. The tapes were submitted to the Institut de Physique du Globe de Paris for acoustic analysis. The analysis was conducted. A report was produced. The report has never been publicly released. David Hazeler, who died in 2001, mentioned the tapes in private correspondence with other British cavers, preserved in the British Cave Research Association's archive. He described the analysis as inconclusive in ways that the Institut de Physique was uncomfortable specifying. Scientists publish null results constantly. Inconclusive acoustic data from a geological survey would be routine. If the analysis produced nothing of note, there was nothing preventing its publication. The specific discomfort Hazeler described, not the inconclusiveness itself, but the discomfort of specifying it, is what never got resolved. In 1963, a Belgian expedition, well-credentialed, with multiple members who had descended the Berger before, turned back at 2,600 feet. There was no flood event on that date, no weather event, no equipment failure logged. The official report cited conditions and noted a unanimous decision to retreat. Team members gave inconsistent accounts of what specifically prompted it. 2 members declined follow-up interviews, entirely unusual in the tightly networked world of European competitive caving, where everyone knew everyone and people talked. Here's what the cave's physical data adds. The air currents in the Berger's lower chambers exceed what the known passages can account for. Air moves through cave systems because passages connect to other openings. The volume and velocity of airflow in the lower sections imply additional passage networks at depths not yet reached. In 1989, a French expedition pushing into new territory at 3,900 feet documented a temperature anomaly, sections running 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the surrounding geology should be. No geothermal source was identified. The anomaly is in the peer-reviewed literature. It remains unresolved. The deepest accessible point ends at a submerged siphon too narrow, too pressurized for any diver to safely penetrate. The Berger has been explored for more than 70 years. It has never been fully mapped. The mainstream explanation is physics and human psychology. Underground sounds are produced by water behavior and geological settling. The 1963 Belgian team turned back on instinct about flooding risk. Experienced cavers live by instinct. The temperature anomaly has a mineralogical explanation that hasn't been specified yet, but null results are published. They fill journals. The entire purpose of a scientific institute analyzing unusual acoustic data is to produce a publishable finding, positive or negative. If the tapes contained nothing remarkable, publication would have taken a paragraph and a form. The choice not to publish is a decision, not a default. And two experienced cavers from a competitive professional community, people who had reputations built on completing descents, refused to discuss a retreat. In that culture, silence about a failed expedition isn't normal. It's a statement. What was on those tapes that the Institut de Physique couldn't comfortably specify? Why did two members of the 1963 Belgian expedition refuse interviews in a community where everyone else talked? And what is warmer than the surrounding geology a mile below the Vercors Plateau? The Gouffre Berger defeated the best cavers in Europe not by killing them, but by producing silence where there should have been answers. The next cave didn't need to fight anyone. It just waited, sealed beneath a Mayan city, while the people above forgot what was below them. Number 4. Loltun Cave. You're an archaeologist working for Mexico's National Museum in 1888, and you're 300 feet into a limestone cave under the Yucatan jungle, holding a lantern in a passage the Maya have been using for centuries. You're cataloging the familiar evidence, ceramic offerings, carved reliefs in the Maya tradition, bones. Then your light catches something on the wall that stops you completely. It's a hand. Chiseled directly into the limestone, not painted. Precise, intentional. You write it down as ancient and move on. What you don't know, what no one will confirm for another 100 years, is that the hand is 9,000 years old. That it predates the earliest known Maya civilization by 7,000 years. That the people who carved it cannot be connected to any identified culture in the Western Hemisphere. Loltun sits in the municipality of Oaxcutzcab in Yucatan State. The Maya used it for water collection, ritual, and burial across their entire classic period. But underneath the Maya evidence is something much older, and it has no explanation. Carbon dating published in the journal Mexicon in 1991 placed the carved hands near the cave's entrance at 7,000 BCE, 9,000 years before the present. The iconographic style doesn't match Olmec, pre-Olmec, or any precursor culture that archaeologists trace Maya roots back through. Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, INAH, has acknowledged the dating in institutional documents. It has not offered an explanation for who made them, but the hands are not the most unsettling thing in Loltun. The stone is. In the cave's central chamber, a natural limestone pillar rises from floor to ceiling. Unlike the surrounding formations, it rings when struck. Not a dull thud, a sustained, resonant tone that travels through the entire cave system. Researchers measuring the frequency found it sits at between 18 and 22 Hz. That range sits at the boundary of what is technically classified as infrasound. Infrasound at those frequencies does something specific to human beings. In 2003, Dr. Vic Tandy and Dr. Tony Lawrence at Coventry University, England, published peer-reviewed research establishing that infrasound near 18 Hz produces measurable physiological effects, unease, disorientation, a sense of presence, and peripheral visual disturbances. The feeling of being watched, the compulsion to leave, both documented as biological responses to infrasound at 18 to 22 Hz. The Loltun stone produces this frequency when struck. More significant, the rock surrounding the pillar appears to have been shaped. Carvings at the base and sides are not decorative, they're acoustic. They redirect and amplify the stone's resonant output into the central chamber. Someone engineered this column to produce a specific biological effect in a specific space. Whether that was the unknown culture that carved the hands or the Maya who came later, INAH has not said. What's clear from the engineering is that whoever modified the stone understood exactly what 18 Hz infrasound does to a human standing in a sealed limestone room. In 2009, researchers from the National Autonomous University of Mexico UNAM ran a ground-penetrating radar survey of Loltun. They identified a sealed chamber approximately 60 feet wide and 30 feet deep directly below the site's primary ceremonial area. The chamber is not accessible from any known passage in the cave. The radar profile suggests it was sealed by deliberate stone placement rather than natural formation. UNAM archaeologists filed a formal excavation request with INAH in 2011. It was denied on grounds of site preservation. A follow-up request in 2016 received no response. The mainstream explanation is that Loltun is a significant but not anomalous Maya and pre-Maya ritual site. The acoustic properties of the Loltun stone are natural, if unusual. The acoustic modifications are consistent with known Maya interest in sound as a ceremonial element. But the carved hands are not Maya. That's established, not debated. The 7,000-year gap between the known artists and the oldest known civilization in this region isn't a rounding error. It's an entire era of human presence, with no cultural attribution and no surviving material record beyond the hands themselves. The acoustic engineering of the Loltun stone is not decoration, it's functional precision. And the sealed chamber is positioned directly below the most carefully engineered acoustic feature in the cave. The spatial relationship between those two facts is not coincidental. What is in the sealed chamber that INAH has refused to open for 15 years? Who were the people who carved those hands 7,000 years before the Maya walked this jungle? Is the infrasound why expeditions go silent in Loltun? Not metaphorically, but physiologically. Loltun doesn't silence you with emptiness. It silences you by producing, in the stone itself, a frequency that makes the boundary between real and imagined unreliable. The next cave on this list is different. Everything inside it should be dead. And it isn't. Number 5. Movile Cave. You're a Romanian hydrogeologist named Cristian Lascu, and it's 1986, and you're drilling for thermal water near the Black Sea coast outside the city of Mangalia. The drill breaks through into a pocket of air. You stop. Air pockets during drilling aren't unusual. You expect voids in carbonate rock, but this one has pressure. The air coming up through the drill hole is warmer than the surface temperature, and it smells wrong. Not geological wrong, biologically wrong. It smells like something is living in it. You rig a descent and go in. You've just broken open a world that has been sealed since the Miocene epoch. The air you're breathing is 5.5 million years old. Movile Cave sits beneath a flat, agricultural plain near Mangalia in Constanta County, southeastern Romania, about a mile inland from the Black Sea. The cave was discovered not by exploration but by accident, during a geological survey for a power plant project. What Lascu found inside is, by the assessment of biologists who have studied it for 4 decades, among the most biologically significant discoveries of the 20th century. The cave air is toxic. That is not a colloquial exaggeration, it is a clinical description. The atmosphere contains between 7 and 12% carbon dioxide compared to the 0.04% in outside air. Oxygen levels run at 1 to 2% compared to 21% at the surface. Hydrogen sulfide is present at concentrations that exceed occupational safety limits. Scientists who enter Movile wear gas masks. They are time-limited to a maximum of a few hours inside. Longer exposure causes neurological effects, and yet, inside it, there is an ecosystem. 48 species have been identified in Movile Cave. Every single one of them, every spider, every water scorpion, every pseudoscorpion, every isopod, every cave leech is found nowhere else on Earth. They evolved in total isolation during the 5.5 million years the cave was sealed. They are blind. They are pigmentless. They are the product of 5.5 million years of evolution in a space where sunlight never reached, where the rules of survival were entirely different from anything above ground. The ecosystem runs on chemosynthesis. At the surface of the cave's underground lake and in its muddy banks, colonies of bacteria oxidize hydrogen sulfide, converting a toxic compound into energy, and everything else in the cave eats those bacteria, or eats the things that eat the bacteria. There is no photosynthesis. There is no sunlight in the energy chain. The entire food web runs on chemistry alone. This is the only known isolated terrestrial chemosynthetic ecosystem on Earth. Comparable systems exist at hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor. Finding one on land, in a cave you can walk to, was not supposed to be possible. Cristian Lascu reported his discovery to the Romanian Academy of Sciences shortly after 1986. The initial response was classified. Romania, in 1986, was still under Nicolae Ceausescu's communist dictatorship. Foreign scientists were not notified. The find was logged, the site was secured, and the nature of the discovery was restricted to a small group of authorized Romanian researchers. After the fall of the Ceausescu government in 1989, the cave began to be accessible to Western researchers. Biological papers began appearing in the early 1990s. But the comprehensive biological inventory, the full accounting of all 48 species, their evolutionary relationships, the mechanisms of the chemosynthetic ecosystem was not completed and published until 2010. 22 years between discovery and full scientific disclosure. The stated reason: verification. The findings were so unusual that multiple independent confirmations were required before publication. Critics within the scientific community have pointed out that the 22-year timeline is not standard for cave biology, regardless of the findings' significance. Peer-reviewed biology journals regularly publish preliminary findings and update them through successive studies. 22 years of silence about an entirely unknown ecosystem, one with 48 species, found nowhere else on Earth, is not verification protocol. It's delay. The mainstream explanation for the 22-year delay is institutional: the communist government's secrecy practices, the disruption of regime change, and the genuine need for verification of extraordinary findings. The restriction on access today reflects conservation necessity, not concealment. But 22 years is 22 years. And the question of what the communist government thought it had found, what strategic value they assigned to a cave full of blind spiders running on sulfur chemistry, has never been answered. The classified designation from 1986 remains. The documents explaining that designation are in Romanian state archives and have not been declassified. What did the Ceausescu government think Movile Cave was worth hiding? What is in those 1986 classification documents? And if a sealed cave can preserve an independent ecosystem for 5.5 million years, producing life that evolved entirely without us, what else is waiting in caves we haven't broken into yet? Movile sealed itself with chemistry and darkness. The next cave sealed itself with size, and it produced silence not by what it contains, but by what it refuses to show anyone. Number 6. Hang Son Doong. You're a farmer named Ho Khan, and it's 1991, and you're moving through the jungle of Phong Nha Ke Bang in central Vietnam's Quang Binh province, when the ground opens up and wind comes out of it. Not a breeze, not the slow exhale of a limestone crack, wind and sound. A roaring from below that you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. You step to the edge. You look down and see nothing, only black. The roar continues. You walk away. You walk away, and you don't go back, and you don't tell anyone where it is, and then you spend the next 17 years trying to remember where you were standing when the ground spoke. In 2008, Ho Khan found the entrance again. In 2009, a British caving team went in and found the largest cave chamber on Earth. Hang Son Doong Mountain River Cave runs for 5.5 miles through the karst limestone of Phong Nha Ke Bang National Park. Its largest chamber reaches 650 feet from floor to ceiling and 500 feet across. To put that in terms that land physically, you could stack a 40-story building inside it, and the roof would still be 100 feet over the building's top. A Boeing 747 could fly through it. When the British Cave Research Association team led by Howard Limbert first descended in 2009, it took them a full day's caving to reach the point where they could see the far wall of the main chamber. The cave has its own jungle. In 2 places, the ceiling has collapsed, and through these openings called dew lines, enough light enters to sustain full canopy forest, with trees reaching 100 feet. The jungle is primary old growth, undisturbed, with no record of human entry before 2009. The cave has its own weather. Local guides and the 2009 British team documented what they call wind events, sudden pressure changes in which the airflow through the cave's passages accelerates dramatically, producing the roaring that Håkan heard in 1991 from the surface above. These events are not predictable by external weather conditions. During a wind event, gusts inside the cave can knock a person down. The cave has its own clouds. Mist forms inside the main chamber when warm, humid air from outside meets the cave's cooler internal temperature. Actual clouds, not ground fog, but condensation clouds at mid-chamber height have been photographed inside Hang Son Doong. This is a cave that generates its own precipitation. In 2012, a LiDAR mapping survey of the cave was conducted by a joint Vietnamese international team. The acoustic measurements taken during that survey produced a finding that has not been satisfactorily resolved. The resonance time of sounds in the main chamber does not match the calculated acoustic resonance for a space of its measured dimensions. The cave, by the physics of sound reflection, should echo differently than it does. The most likely explanation, one the survey team noted but could not confirm, is that the cave continues beyond its visible walls. There are additional chambers or passages connecting to the main space that the light and equipment of a 2012 survey could not locate. Here's where it becomes something other than a geological curiosity. Access to Hang Son Doong is controlled not by Phong Nha Ke Bang National Park Authority, which manages the surrounding protected forest, but by Vietnam's Ministry of National Defense. Expedition permits for the cave must be approved by the military, not by the park or tourism authorities. That arrangement is not standard for a natural wonder, it is standard for a strategic asset. Certain passages in the cave's deeper sections are marked as restricted zones. They do not appear on any map released to the public. Expedition guides are not permitted to enter them and are not told what's in them. In 2019, an international scientific survey team, geologists from France and the United Kingdom, formally credentialed, with full Vietnamese academic sponsorship, was denied access to 3 specific passages during their authorized expedition. The Vietnamese military officials accompanying the expedition cited security considerations. The scientists were not told what security considerations applied to an unmapped cave passage 300 feet underground. The mainstream explanation is strategic sensitivity, not mystery. Vietnam maintains tight control over underground geography that could be relevant to military tunneling, water supply, or defense purposes. The acoustic anomalies reflect the limits of current measurement technology rather than actual unmapped space. But the acoustic measurements from 2012 are peer-reviewed data. The resonance doesn't match the chamber. Something is there that the measurements can't account for. And military restrictions on cave passages have no precedent in any other speleological site in Southeast Asia. Vietnam has other caves. None of them require Ministry of National Defense approval to visit. What is in the restricted passages that required a military escort to turn international scientists away from? What is producing the acoustic anomaly in a chamber that has been surveyed to the limits of LiDAR technology? And what made Håkan walk away from that roaring in 1991 and not tell a single person what he'd found for 17 years? The cave produces silence by scale. The next one produced silence by deliberate policy, because what was found inside it was, for decades, something powerful people needed no one to discuss. Number 7. Jeita Grotto. You're looking at the drinking water supply of 1.5 million people. The water flows from a cave. The cave's connection to the city's water intake has been confirmed by hydrological tracers. Dye placed inside the cave appeared in Beirut's water system 11 to 18 days later. Nobody knows the route it traveled. The passage connecting Jeita Grotto to Beirut's tap water has never been mapped. Independent scientists have requested permission to map it since 1975. Every request has been refused. That's not a mystery from ancient history. That's the situation right now, today. In a city of 1.5 million people, drinking water from a source no one has fully charted. Jeita Grotto sits in the Nahr al-Kalb Valley, 14 miles north of Beirut, carved through Jurassic limestone by the river that flows from it. The cave has two levels, an upper grotto and a lower grotto, partially submerged and navigable by boat at lower water levels. The known system extends for at least 5.6 miles. The first Western documentation came in 1836, when an American missionary named Reverend William Thompson followed the river upstream and found an entrance that nearby villages officially described as non-existent. Thompson went in. He found bones, pottery, and what appeared to be an altar. He published an account. The cave was formally acknowledged. The Phoenicians knew it. Ritual objects consistent with Baal cult practice were recovered from the cave's entrance area by Lebanese archaeologists in the 1950s. The American University of Beirut geology team that explored it in 1873 documented unusual mineral formations in the upper grotto and heard sounds from deeper sections they could not reach, sounds described as rhythmic and sustained, not attributable to the river's flow. Here's what happened to the cave after that. In the First World War, the Ottoman military used the upper grotto as an ammunition storage facility. Explosives were held against limestone walls for 4 years. The effect on the cave's interior and on any sealed lower passages has never been assessed. In 1920, French Mandate authorities deliberately flooded the upper grotto. The stated purpose was destroying Ottoman military infrastructure. Water levels rose approximately 30 feet. Sections accessible before 1920 were sealed by sediment and debris. They have not been reopened. In the Lebanese Civil War, from 1975 to 1990, the cave was used as a weapons depot by multiple factions. The Lebanese Speleological Club maintained records through the war period. Those records include accounts from members who entered in the early conflict years and heard sounds from unmapped lower passages, intermittent and rhythmic, inconsistent with the behavior of flowing water. Water in caves produces continuous sound that varies with flow rate. Intermittent rhythmic sound suggests something else. The Lebanese Speleological Club records do not interpret the accounts, they just note them. In 2001, a UNESCO hydrology study found that the water chemistry emerging from Jeita's lower depths contains mineral signatures inconsistent with the surrounding Jurassic limestone. The mineral profile suggests the water originates from a deeper aquifer system feeding into the visible cave from below, a secondary complex at significantly greater depth. The study flagged this as requiring further investigation. No further investigation has been authorized. The cave is now administered by a Lebanese government tourism authority. The upper grotto is open to visitors. Independent scientific requests for full hydrological access to map the water route to Beirut to investigate the UNESCO study's findings, to assess the 1920 flood-sealed sections have been consistently declined since the end of the Civil War. The reason given is structural fragility and risk of contaminating the water supply. The mainstream explanation is that the unknown water route is a routine karst hydrology problem. Underground rivers frequently travel through passages too small for human entry. The 2001 UNESCO findings indicate a deep aquifer, which is geologically normal. The sounds reported during the Civil War reflect unreliable perception in a wartime environment. But the water route to Beirut feeds 1.5 million people and has never been mapped. That's not a practical limitation, it's a policy choice maintained for 50 years. Karst hydrology studies of urban water supplies are standard practice worldwide, conducted routinely without damaging the water supply. The specific, repeated refusal to authorize this work at Jeita has no parallel in any comparable urban water system. And the 1920 flooding was deliberate. It wasn't a natural event that sealed the lower sections. Someone decided to raise the water and seal whatever was down there. What were the French Mandate authorities hiding by flooding the cave in 1920? What were the sounds the Lebanese Speleological Club documented in passages no one has reached? And why is the water of 1.5 million people flowing through a route no one is allowed to map? Jeita has been controlled by every empire that touched Lebanon, and each one left a layer of secrecy over what the one before it found. The next cave was controlled by one man's academic reputation, and the institution that destroyed him is the same institution now deciding what you're allowed to see inside. Number 8. Cave of Altamira. You're a Spanish nobleman named Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola, and it's 1879, and your 8-year-old daughter, Maria, has just looked up at the cave ceiling while you were excavating the floor and said, in the matter-of-fact tone that children use when they see the obvious thing the adults are missing. "Papa, look," painted bulls. You look up. You see a ceiling covered in bison, deer, boars, drawn in ochre and charcoal and manganese, with a technical command of anatomy and shading that belongs to a trained artist, not a primitive hand. Animals in motion, animals in perspective. You reach up and touch the stone, and the paint is dry and old in a way that stone gets when something has sat undisturbed for longer than recorded memory. You spend the next 9 years trying to get the academic establishment to believe you. Then you die. 14 years after your death, the man who led the campaign to destroy your reputation publishes a public apology. The cave of Altamira is near Santillana del Mar in Cantabria, in northern Spain, and what Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola found on that ceiling in 1879 is now understood to be among the most significant artistic achievements in human history. The paintings date to between 14,000 and 36,000 years ago, a range that spans the Upper Paleolithic, representing multiple generations, possibly multiple centuries, of artists returning to this specific chamber to add to what those before them had begun. When Sautuola presented his findings at the 1880 Congress of Prehistoric Anthropology in Lisbon, the French archaeologist Édouard Cartailhac led the assembled experts in declaring the paintings fraudulent. His argument was that the art was too sophisticated, that Paleolithic humans were not capable of this level of achievement, that someone had recently painted the ceiling, and that Sautuola himself was either deceived or complicit. The Spanish academic establishment followed Cartailhac's lead. Sautuola was investigated, scrutinized, and publicly characterized as either a fool or a fraud. He died in 1888. He died with the cave above him officially dismissed as a hoax. In 1902, Cartailhac published an essay in the journal L'Anthropologie titled Mea culpa d'un sceptique, a skeptic's admission of guilt. He acknowledged that similar paintings had been found in other caves across France and Spain, conclusively authenticated, and that Altamira was genuine. He admitted he had been wrong. Sautuola had been right about everything and had spent his last years defending himself against people who refused to look at the evidence. The cave was closed permanently in 1977 after visitor traffic caused carbon dioxide and humidity damage to the paintings. A replica, the Altamira Museum, with exact copies of the painted ceiling opened nearby. Here is what the replica doesn't include. Hugo Obermeier, a German-Spanish archaeologist, conducted excavations at Altamira in 1924 and 1925. In addition to the primary painted gallery, the ceiling Maria found Obermeier documented the existence of at least 3 additional chambers extending deeper into the cave system. He noted carved reliefs and painted marks in 2 of them. He recommended formal excavation. His recommendation was noted. Access to those chambers was restricted by Spanish authorities after 1940, when the Franco government developed an official interest in Altamira as a cultural asset of the Spanish state. The chambers Obermeier identified have not been publicly entered since 1940. The Spanish Ministry of Culture acknowledges their existence when asked directly. No Spanish government since Franco's death in 1975 has authorized access. In 2012, a research team led by Dr. Alistair Pike at the University of Bristol published findings in the journal Science presenting uranium-thorium dating results from Altamira. Several paintings came back with dates of up to 40,800 years ago. If those dates are accurate, the paintings are not just the oldest cave art in Europe. They predate the current academic consensus for when anatomically modern Homo sapiens arrived in the Iberian Peninsula. The mainstream timeline has humans arriving in Iberia around 40,000 years ago. Paintings dated to 40,800 years ago suggest either that humans arrived earlier than the record shows, or that the people who made these paintings were not the humans that the standard model places in that location at that time. The Spanish National Research Council has not authorized independent verification of the 2012 dating using an alternative radiometric method. The cave is closed. Independent access to confirm or refute the dates requires government permission. That permission has not been granted. The mainstream explanation for the sealed chambers is conservation. They are fragile. The Franco-era restriction reflects mid-20th century archaeological priorities that have simply never been revisited. The 2012 dating is controversial in academic circles, and the dates may reflect contamination. But Altamira is the cave that the professional consensus of 1880 declared a fraud specifically because the art was too good. The institution that destroyed Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola is the same tradition of gatekeeping that now controls what gets excavated and what gets dated and what gets released. It was wrong about the ceiling in 1880. The sealed chambers haven't been opened in 85 years. What's in the chambers Obermeyer found in 1925, that the Franco government sealed in 1940, and every Spanish government since has left closed? If the paintings predate Homo sapiens' accepted arrival in Iberia, who made them? And why won't Spain authorize independent verification of dates that would rewrite the human timeline? The cave that gave us the oldest art on the continent has been mostly closed for nearly 50 years. The next cave is closed for a different reason. It's 1,000 feet deep, the walls are perfectly vertical, and the drop kills you before you reach the bottom. Number 9. Majlis Al Jinn. You're a geologist named Don Davidson, and it's 1983, and you're standing on the Selma Plateau in the Hajar Mountains of eastern Oman, rigging a descent rope through a hole in the limestone that the local Bedouin have called Koshilat Makandeli for as long as anyone can remember. The name for the wider cave below doesn't require a geologist to translate. Majlis Al Jinn means meeting place of the spirits. The local population doesn't go in. They have names for each of the 3 sinkholes on the plateau surface. Each one drops approximately 400 feet to the same chamber below. You've read the geological survey. The limestone on this plateau is the wrong type and age to support a void of significant size. The cavity shouldn't be there. Your rope is in. You go over the edge. You fall for 400 feet and enter a chamber so large your headlamp cannot find the far wall. Majlis Al Jinn sits beneath the Selma Plateau in eastern Oman's Hajar Mountains. Don Davidson and his wife Kay were the first people to descend into it on record. The dimensions confirmed by subsequent survey expeditions are not easy to hold in mind all at once. Approximately 1,000 feet long, 650 feet wide, 460 feet high, total volume approaches 50 million cubic feet. 3 separate sinkholes on the plateau, each requiring a 400-foot vertical descent, all open into the same space. The geology that produced the chamber is a problem. The Selma Plateau limestone is Cretaceous formation, relatively young, and not the type of rock that typically hosts cavities of this magnitude. The standard dissolution processes that produce caves require specific water chemistry, specific structural conditions, and specific timescales. Researchers who have studied Majlis Al Jinn's formation have not agreed on a mechanism that accounts for a chamber this size in this geology. Multiple geological papers note the discrepancy. None resolve it. Don Davidson's 1983 descent was the first human entry into a chamber that had apparently never held a footprint. He documented the descent, the dimensions, the geological observations. Then the team returned to the surface, and they didn't publish for 11 years. The geological report appeared in the journal Cave Science in 1994, 11 years after the descent. No interim bulletins, no preliminary reports, no conference presentations in the intervening decade. The most significant cave discovery in Oman's documented history produced a decade of silence from the people who made it. The reason given: ongoing study and the complexity of the geological analysis. There is no geological analysis from a single surveyed chamber, however large, that requires 11 years to produce a publishable finding. The cave sits beneath specific geography. The Al Hamar Palace, the Sultan of Oman's summer residence, is located on the same plateau, approximately 2 miles from the nearest sinkhole. Access to Majlis Al Jinn requires crossing land administered by the Royal Guard of Oman, the Sultan's personal security force, distinct from the regular military. Expedition permits are granted inconsistently and denied without stated reason by an authority that is not required to explain its decisions. Several international expeditions have been approved. Others have been refused. The cave itself contains nothing. That's what makes it strange. Of every major cave system studied by biologists, none at this volume have been found biologically sterile. Bat colonies exist in virtually every cave large enough to shelter them on every continent except Antarctica. Movile Cave, sealed at far lower volume, in far more hostile atmospheric conditions, hosts 48 endemic species. Majlis Al Jinn has been surveyed for biological activity. No bats, no insects, no microbial films, no water. Nothing alive in 50 million cubic feet of cave with 3 separate surface openings through which animals could naturally enter. The probability of a cave this large remaining biologically empty, given the surface access and the timescales involved, is not a geological curiosity. It is an anomaly. The acoustic behavior compounds it. Multiple expeditions document that sound inside Majlis Al Jinn doesn't behave as the physics of enclosed spaces predicts. A chamber 460 feet high should produce substantial, measurable resonance. Expeditions report instead that the cave is acoustically subdued, almost dead, with sounds that dissipate before returning. This behavior is consistent with a chamber connected to additional void spaces that absorb reflected sound energy before it can echo back. The chamber may be an entrance to something larger. No survey has been permitted to investigate the walls in sections closest to the Royal Guard access zone. The mainstream explanation is that Majlis Al Jinn is a remarkable but natural geological feature. The biological emptiness reflects dry atmospheric conditions that don't support cave-adapted life. The acoustic behavior reflects specific chamber geometry, but 50 million cubic feet with 3 surface openings contains nothing living. No cave of comparable volume documented anywhere on Earth is biologically sterile. Dry atmospheric conditions don't prevent bats. Bats colonize the driest caves in the Saharan fringe. Something has prevented life from colonizing a space it would naturally fill, and no survey has been allowed to investigate the sections of the cave closest to the palace. What is producing the acoustic deadness in a chamber this size? What has prevented any biological colonization through 3 surface openings? What is the Sultan keeping under his summer residence under the authority of his personal guard? Majlis Al Jinn is silence defined by scale. The last cave on this list is silence defined by something entirely different by crystals, the size of houses, temperatures that cook you alive, and 50,000-year-old life that a mining company decided to drown. Number 10. Naica Crystal Cave. You're a miner working for the Panoles Silver Company, and it's April 2000, and you're drilling exploratory tunnels 980 feet below the Chihuahuan Desert outside Naica, in Chihuahua, Mexico. The drill breaks through into a pocket. The air coming through the break is wrong. It's hot, not warm, hot and wet, in the way that a pressure cooker is wet. You lower a light through the drill hole. The cave below you is full of columns. Each one white, semi-translucent, massive. The smallest are taller than a man. The largest stretches 37 feet long, 4 feet across, and weighs an estimated 55 tons. They grow from every surface, angling toward each other in the silence of 500,000 years of undisturbed chemistry. You have found the largest natural crystals on Earth. You've also found a cave that will kill you in 10 minutes. The Cave of Crystals, Cueva de los Cristales, was discovered by brothers Juan and Pedro Sanchez on that April morning in 2000, accessible only because Panoles had been continuously pumping water out of the mine since the 1970s, lowering the water table enough to expose passages that were naturally flooded. The cave had been sealed and saturated with hot, mineral-rich water for approximately 500,000 years. The conditions that produce the crystals cannot be replicated industrially. Stable temperature of 136 degrees Fahrenheit, 99% humidity, high calcium sulfate saturation. Without full protective equipment, an ice-packed refrigeration vest, and a breathing system, an unprotected human loses consciousness in roughly 10 minutes. Even with protection, maximum safe exposure is 45 minutes. The cave is trying to kill you the entire time you're inside. In 2009, NASA astrobiologist Penelope Boston led a team in to study the crystal surfaces. Inside microscopic fluid inclusions, pockets of water sealed within the crystals during their growth, they found microorganisms of previously unknown species, bacteria, dormant but alive, sealed inside the crystals for an estimated 50,000 years, not dead, not fossilized, dormant, metabolically suspended. When the team extracted the inclusions under controlled laboratory conditions, the organisms resumed activity. Life, sealed in crystal, for 50,000 years. Alive. Boston's team did not publish in 2009, not in 2010, not in 2015. The findings were first presented publicly at the American Geophysical Union's Astrobiology Conference in 2017, 8 years between discovery and disclosure. The stated reason: verification. Critics noted that 8 years of silence for findings of this magnitude has no precedent in published astrobiology. The field regularly publishes preliminary findings with stated uncertainty. That's how peer review works. NASA made no public statement about the cave organisms during those 8 years. NASA's involvement had a specific rationale. The Naica cave's conditions superheated, anoxic, mineral-rich, sealed for geological timescales, mirror theoretical models of the Martian subsurface environment. If life can survive 50,000 years at 136 degrees Fahrenheit inside a crystal, the implications for what might exist in analogous conditions on Mars are not small. These organisms are the closest available biological model for extremophile life on another planet. That's why NASA was in a Mexican silver mine. In 2015, Pinolls announced the mine was no longer economically viable. The company stated its intention to cease pumping. In 2017, Pinolls ended pumping. The cave reflooded within months. It is now submerged under approximately 60 feet of water. A submersible camera drone in 2019 found that the reflooding's altered water chemistry had already partially dissolved the exterior surfaces of many crystals. The organisms outside intact fluid inclusions are gone. The sealed organisms inside intact inclusions may still be alive in the submerged crystals. Nobody can reach them. Mexico's environmental authority, Semarnat, conducted no formal investigation into whether Pinolls' decision to reflood a site of acknowledged international scientific significance constituted an environmental violation. There is no legal framework that protected the cave from its owner's decision to stop spending money on it. The mainstream explanation is economics. The mine was losing money. Maintaining pumps indefinitely is not a reasonable obligation for a private company. Reflooding was a business decision. But 50,000-year-old living organisms were not a geological formation. They were the most significant biological discovery of the decade, with direct implications for the search for life on other planets. The company that flooded them was not required to notify regulators, not required to allow additional study time, and not investigated afterward. 8 years of silence between finding the organisms and disclosing them. Then, once disclosed, the cave was flooded within the same year. These 10 caves span 4 continents and thousands of years of documented human inquiry. Cueva de los Tallos, where Neil Armstrong descended and came up without a word. Chiquibul, where the Maya traveled 2 miles underground to make offerings to something, and the people who went looking never came out. The Gouffre Berger, where acoustic recordings were handed to a government institute and never released. Loltun, where engineered infrasound makes your senses unreliable, and a sealed chamber sits off-limits for 15 years. Movile, sealed for 5.5 million years, classified by a communist government, partially disclosed after 2 decades of silence. Son Doong, under military access control, with passages international scientists have been turned away from. Jeita, the source of Beirut's water, with a route no one is permitted to map. Altamira, where the man who proved Paleolithic humans were artists died being called a fraud, and where paintings that may predate Homo sapiens' presence in Iberia remain unstudied in sealed chambers. Majlis Al Jinn, 50 million cubic feet of acoustic silence under a sultan's palace, containing nothing, echoing nothing. And Naica, where the most significant biological discovery of the decade was disclosed and then drowned by an accounting decision in the same calendar year. The pattern is this: every cave that produced something impossible was followed by silence, official silence, institutional silence, personal silence, the silence of Neil Armstrong, the silence of the Institut de Physique, the silence of the Ceausescu government, the silence of the Vietnamese military, the silence of Spain's Ministry of Culture, the silence of a mining company that flooded 50,000-year-old life and walked away. If you know where to look, the silence tells you everything. Subscribe if you want to keep looking. Like if this opened a door you didn't know was there. And drop a comment below, where in the world are you watching from? People from places I never expected keep showing up in these comments, and I want to know where the curious ones are.